Well, my guest today is an expert in eyewitness testimony. He's taken it for years and brought people to trial over eyewitness testimony. His name, of course, is the great J. Warner Wallace. He's with us again. He was on last week in the podcast we air on the American Family Radio Network because we were discussing his brand new graphic novel that he's written with his son called Case Files, Murder and Meaning. If you hadn't listened to the podcast last week, you need to. But today we're shifting gears and we're talking a little bit about eyewitness testimony. So, Jim, I know you've interacted with Bart Ehrman before, particularly in writing. Does he have a point here? What would you say if you were debating him and he had brought this up?
Well, a couple of things. So, yeah, of course, I try to be pretty fair about, and I have written a little bit about Bart, but not too much. I don't find myself kind of trying to be an adversarial role. I mean, everyone's got some observations they make about eyewitness claims. Few people, though, have had to bring eyewitness claims to trial to test them in front of a jury. And that's one of the benefits you get, right? Like, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I do understand what eyewitness testimony looks like. And I've never had a case, ever, in which I didn't have what somebody could call contradictory eyewitness accounts. I mean, I just have never had a clean case like that. We've never lost a case because it turns out we have to kind of define like what is necessary to prove an event in the past. Whether that past is 5 weeks ago, 5 years ago, 5 decades ago, or 5 centuries ago, the question is, what do you need? How much certainty do I need? Now, first of all, it's really easy to dump 20 alleged Bible contradictions in one sentence and make this overwhelming, like, death by 1,000 paper cut kind of objection. But the reality of it is that most of the things he's talking about have been really easily addressed for centuries. And, if you appear to be a man and you appear as an angel who appears to be a man, you're going to get a variety of different descriptions of that being. And if there's, two present, there's also one present. So depending on what you're trying to chronicle, the person who spoke to you, that was one of those two angels. And so that's who appears in that one. Look, in the end, what typically is offered as a unreconcilable contradiction is really not that at all. It's about what I choose to say as a witness. Now, let me tell you how we clear it up in real life. So I get a case, and it's 10 years after the fact, and I've got 5 eyewitness accounts. They are not written by the eyewitnesses. We don't do that. We don't give them a pen and write them. What we do is we have detectives or police officers in the field or in the office interview eyewitnesses and then write a supplemental report that contains the eyewitness account. So the idea, for example, well, you can't trust Luke because he wasn't an eyewitness. Well, no, he's like the detective who's interviewing the eyewitness. It's still an eyewitness account. It's just recorded by a report writer. That's what every case I've ever worked has. So in the end, Mark. Well, who's Mark? Well, Mark is sitting at the feet of Peter. I think there's more than ample both historical and internal evidence to suggest that Mark is really just chronicling the stories of Peter. So in the end, he's the report writer for Peter's account. So you're going to have to kind of weigh these and ask yourself the question, are these eyewitness accounts? Now, I've seen scholars, our friends, who will quickly kind of point to some genre of literature to try to reconcile these differences. But I'm just telling you, if you've got 5 eyewitnesses to a case that happened a year ago, you're going to have what appear to be irreconcilable differences in the accounts. Now, how do I solve it typically? Well, if it's just a decade ago, hopefully these folks are still alive. And I can ask follow-up questions. Because I see in this report you mentioned that this one person said something. Did you see anything else there at that scene? I won't tip to him that I'm looking for, did you see 2 people? But I'll just, did you see anything else there? And now he's going to offer me another part of the story that in the first interview was not the focus of the interview for any variety of reasons. So because I have a second chance to interview him, typically you can reconcile all of the things that appear to be irreconcilable differences, but were simply a matter of either perspective or attitude or a reflection of prior commitments of the witness before he did the interview. Now, here's the other problem I have, though. I have many accounts where both the witness and the report writer are both dead. Hey, by the way, sometimes the witness is dead, but the report writer I can interview, and I'll say, look, he only says he saw one person here. And he might remember, well, no, he saw the same number of people everybody else did, but when I wrote the report, I was just focused on what that one person said. So sometimes the report writer can straighten it out for you if you can re-interview him. But sadly, there are cases I have where both are dead, the witness and the report writer. Well, now what do I do? By the way, you don't think a defense attorney is going to make a huge deal out of this? Of course. Of course they are. It's going to sound a lot like Bart Ehrman just sounded in making that case. And what we have to do is help jurors to understand that even in the same observation, I mean, I wish you could run that test in front of a jury, right? Where have somebody come in and smack me in the back of the head and run out of the courtroom and say, now, jurors, I want you to all write down what you just said. You would see the same level of apparent disagreement for what you know just happened. Just happened. This is because what we do is when we sit as a witness, we bring into the experience all of our own past experiences, all of our desires that help us to focus on certain things you're interested in, you will focus on. If you're somebody who loves shoes, you might know what kind of shoe this guy's wearing. And you could describe it in a way that others would say, I wasn't even sure if he was wearing shoes. Yeah, or I might mistakenly think he's wearing. Now, why would God? This is what it comes down to, though. We have a sense that we have defined terms when it comes to biblical inerrancy and biblical the biblical scriptures that in some ways, why would God, for example, allow there to be differences, textural differences? I mean, just the nature of the report. Why would he allow these differences that seem confusing? And by the way, you don't think these were available and obvious to people in the first century who were assembling the canon? You don't think that Irenaeus, you don't think that Ignatius could look at those gospels and say, these seem to be slightly different? Well, clearly they knew enough in the earliest ages of this to not flinch under the differences because they had access to the people who actually wrote the accounts. And so they could actually do some interviewing of themselves. We don't have that access now. So my thinking on this is that if God wanted to give us 4 accounts that actually met the criteria and standard of any other eyewitness account you might learn of in your own experience as a detective, these 4 accounts have the exact level of variation I would expect to see from 4 eyewitnesses. But again, the idea that I can throw out a number of these contradictions, which have been asked and answered for thousands of years, it really, to me, is a bit of a sneaky play, if you think about it.
You say, I've heard you say this before, that whenever you were at a crime scene and you knew there were eyewitnesses around, you would ensure that the eyewitnesses were separated. In other words, you wouldn't put them all in the back of, say, the same police cruiser, because if they started talking to one another, they may iron out their stories. Why? Unpack that further. Why would you separate them? You wanted variation, in other words, didn't you?
Well, yeah, let's put it this way. If we had one gospel, there'd be no variations.
Right.
Yeah. One gospel, no variations.
Yeah.
And so, but with 2, now we're tempted. Should we harmonize these?
Yeah.
There were people in history who tried to harmonize the gospels.
Yeah.
And they did that because they saw the same thing that we're seeing thousands of years ago. They saw the same thing we're seeing. I don't want the harmonization. Because the harmonization always comes with information loss. You're going to have, I want the subtle differences that are almost confusing, head-scratching differences. I want those because there's some truth that's embedded in there that will account for the differences in the observations or the differences in the descriptions of the observations. It's either going to tell me something about a more robust nature of the event itself or something about the report giver. Like, why would he say it this way? That's going to tell me something about the author because he might be pinning on something different or have his own set of commitments coming into it. And God allows the biblical authors to retain their unique personal dispositions as they're writing the account. And that's why you get these accounts. Now, it's almost like the sense that if this is God ordained, they should be word for word identical. Well, if that was the case, why would you need 4 gospels? You wouldn't. You just need 1. The reason why we have 4 gospels is because the picture is so much more robust. And we're going to learn about that picture. That's why I tell the dispatchers, separate the eyewitnesses. Don't let them harmonize their statement before I get there. Our job as the detective who's reading the reports decades later is to think about the inferences and the harmonization. Like what's the bigger, robust picture? I do not want someone else doing that work before I get there. Give it to me in its messiest form, because that's how humans are.